So, moving right along then in Camille Paglia's Sexual Personae, we're on the chapter that is entitled Apollo and Dionysus. And so what I thought I would do before getting into the chapter itself was to do a bit of an archaeology on these two terms, Apollo and Dionysus, especially as they are crystallized by Nietzsche. But Nietzsche in turn got them from, he took the terms, as we have remarked earlier, he took them from Bachofen, who uses them in a historical sense to refer to two different historical epochs. He has an Amazonian epoch between his first epoch of the Aphroditic Hetyric epoch of swamp-like promiscuity, and then there's an age of Amazonian revolt in there that signifies the transition to the next epoch, the Demetrian matriarchal, the age of Hera and marriage, and then the degeneration of that epoch is the Dionysus cults, which he sees as a regression and a reversion back to the swamp-like promiscuity of the Aphroditic Hetyric, and then this is followed by the Apollonian rationalism of the Romans. That's his little historical model. Nietzsche read it and picked it up from him and takes from him the two terms Apollo and Dionysus and applies them to tragedy to refer, at first glance, simply the Apollonian is the tragic protagonist, and the Dionysian is the chorus. The chorus represents the will, the collective consciousness, and they stand aside and watch this tragic protagonist get enchained in the snares of fate and gobbled up and torn to pieces. So Apollo and Dionysus in that simple sense. But what he has done is he has incorporated, he has based this and overlaid this kind of mythical stratum onto the template of Schopenhauer's philosophy. Schopenhauer was one of his favorite philosophers starting out as an early thinker. And what he has done is taken Schopenhauer's world as representation and will and put Apollo in as a slot that is equivalent to the world as representation and Dionysus as equivalent to the world as will. So the world as representation for Schopenhauer is simply how the mind makes sense out of the world in terms of space, time, and causality. It's the waking intellect. That's the dimension that Nietzsche assigns to the Apollonian. And underneath all of this, felt clearly, but not exactly seen with two eyes, is the world as will. The world is, Schopenhauer's the first German philosopher to dispense with God, and in that slot he puts in will as a cosmic drive driving through all things, including gravity and electromagnetism, as well as the sex drive, bringing everything into being, and that is will, and Nietzsche aligns that with the Dionysian principle. Now Schopenhauer in turn had taken this dichotomy from Immanuel Kant, from Kant's breakdown into the world as two categories, phenomena and noumena. The phenomenal world is the world as it is made manifest to the waking conscious intellect, which is composed of the transcendental aesthetic of space-time. In space and time for Kant are innate, they're innate apparatuses that are built into the human brain, along with the categories of the understanding. And he's got a bunch of them, quantity, quality, relation, and modality, but Schopenhauer shaves all of them off and says only the subcategory of relation, that known as cause and effect, is necessary. All these others can be done away with as overly scholastic. And so for Schopenhauer then, he just shaves it down to the phenomenal realm is simply space, time, and causality, because he says even animals have the faculty of causality inbuilt into their brains as well as space and time, because they're able to make causal inferences just like humans are. He says, when I pull my drapes open, my poodle looks up immediately at the cause of what has just happened. So animals, they have to have causality built into their brains to survive. They have to be able to make inferences that are correct. But they don't have the category of what Schopenhauer called reason. This is different from intelligence. Reason is Vernunft, and it's the human capacity, Schopenhauer says, for the creation of concepts, which animals don't have. But he's using Vernunft in a completely different way from the way that previous German idealist philosophers had used it, because for Kant, Verstand, the understanding, which is opposed to Vernunft, reason, the understanding has to do with all the categories that come with the transcendental aesthetic and the table of categories of the understanding. All of that is Verstand. And Verstand creates the world in front of us, and it has to do with empirical, tangible things. Vernunft, on the other hand, isn't for Kant the faculty of creating higher concepts, but the faculty that deals with metaphysical ideas, with big ideas, God, the soul, freedom, immortality, Platonic ideas, what have you. So Schopenhauer does some tweaking. And then Kant says the world as it is in itself, we can never know. That's a mystery. That's a noumenal mystery. It's not phenomenal, noumenal, X, unknown thing in itself. And Schopenhauer, after having read the Upanishads, however, decided that thing in itself could be known, or at least intuited, as the will, the will that underlies the phenomenal world, after reading the Upanishads, in which he drew an equation between the world as Maya. Maya is the world spread out in space and time, and Brahman is the absolute, the world soul, the cosmic unity underlying everything that he saw. He basically aligned that with Kant's will and the transcendental aesthetic and the categories of the understanding, combine them together to create his apparatus of the principium individuationis, which is the world as phenomenal representation versus the world as will. He just read all this and absorbed it, and he's a classical philologist, so he studied all the Greek plays and Greek culture and so forth, and Bachofen, and he connects all of this to Apollo and Dionysus, so that all of these philosophical connotations come along with Apollo and Dionysus. It isn't just the two gods. Apollo becomes then in Nietzsche the tragic protagonist on stage, but also the larger principle of form, the aesthetic principle of beauty, especially the beauty of the colonnade, the Greek temple with the column, the Greek sculpture. Dionysus has to do with the aesthetic principle of the sublime, however, which is a different aesthetic, and with the chorus, the collective will, and with the deep, dark, earlier Dionysiac cults that were based on human and animal sacrifice that underlay the beauty of Greek culture. He says, oh, how the Greeks must have suffered to have needed to create such beauty. The very fact that they went through this Dionysiac phase of dark religious rites and chthonic underworld mysteries was the very reason why they needed to sublimate it all with the creation of the most physically, visibly beautiful culture that has ever existed. Nobody did better sculpture than the Greeks, not even the Hindus. So that's Nietzsche. And then Spengler then inherits this dichotomy, this whole philosophical tradition in German thought, and he translates it into two principles called waking being and being. Waking being, Wachsein, he aligns with the Apollonian tradition. Being, or Dasein, he aligns with the Dionysus tradition. And yes, Heidegger did in fact read Spengler early on in his career before he wrote Being and Time. So I don't know whether he has taken Dasein from Spengler or not. He discards Wachsein. But for Spengler, Wachsein is simply waking being. Dasein is being in the sense of the instincts, the morphogenetic, the morphogenetic properties of the world that bring everything silently into being and don't require the intellect to rationalize or figure any of it out. Being is pulse, beat, rhythm, periodicity, the planets going in their cycles, the flower coming up out of the earth, shoals of fish and flocks of bird all moving as one with one mind in coordinated fashion. They're not moving chaotically. So some force, some will that is larger than each individual bird is moving that flock and moving through it. Same thing with hive animals, or hive insects like the Hymenoptera, wasps and bees and ants. Everything is very coordinated. It's not a bunch of individualists making their own free will decisions. That's not being. Being is collective. It is transpersonal. It runs the cosmos. It's been there forever. Waking being comes along much later. Things wake up out of this dark, chthonic underworld later on. The invention of waking being is a much later invention at every level, wherever you look at it. And waking being is simply waking consciousness, figuring things out. And then Spengler, later on in the second volume, translates this into the two principles of, in human culture, these become, waking being becomes the causality principle in the sciences, which creates a world picture, versus the destiny idea, which in the arts is related to the idea of the world as fate. And each civilization, he says, comes up with its own different sort of Dionysiac principle of fate. For the Egyptians, it was Ma'at, the cosmic impersonal truth that runs the world. In China, it's Tao. For the Arabian Jewish civilization, it is Kismet, fate comes directly to you from God. The book of Job is the perfect exemplar of that. In Greek culture, it's Moira, and all the gods are subordinate to Moira. It doesn't come from God. Even Zeus must obey Moira. Moira are the spinners who spin the fates. Fate is something that is inflicted upon a man in Greek myth. And in Western, Northern, Scandinavian civilization, it is weird. Weird is the unfolding of destiny from within the individual as the world unfolds itself as a metaphysical species of individuality unto itself from each individual. That's the Scandinavian conception of the subject, which is bound up with a new idea of fate there. So each civilization has a different destiny idea, and each civilization has a different causality principle, insofar as each civilization comes up with a different theory of matter. The theory of matter, as amongst the Greeks, is a bunch of passive atoms being knocked around by necessity, is consistent with that earlier mythical destiny idea where the tragic protagonist is pushed around by fate. Just as our aggressive Northern Faustian idea of atoms as these, that begins with Leibniz, as these units of force aggressively conquering space, is the same thing as the Scandinavian destiny idea with the aggressive individual, the Viking mentality, conquering the world. It translates even into the causality principle there with the theory of atoms. The Hindus had a theory of atoms as well that is lost to us, but every civilization has one. So this is Apollo and Dionysus. This is the whole architecture of it that Paglia is inheriting. I don't know how much reading in that tradition that she's done, but she certainly read Spengler and Nietzsche, and she has inherited this and now transforms it into her two principles, where Apollo for her represents the principle. Well, she says Dionysus represents the principle of identification. Apollo represents the principle of objectification. Apollo is the gaze. Dionysus has nothing to do with the eye. It obliterates and disintegrates the gaze. And so what she does in this chapter then is she constructs a sort of a quaternio, what Jung would call a mandala, a quaternio of deities, 3 female goddesses and 1 male god, Athene, Artemis, Aphrodite, and then, so you got the 3 female deities and then the 1 male deity, Dionysus, although she does have Hermes in there briefly, perhaps as a transcendent 5th function in the center there. Hermes is the axis. He travels up and down between all 3 worlds, carrying messages to them. And as Jung said, for every trinity, there's always a hidden 4th term there. The classical Christian Trinity is missing the Virgin Mary as the hidden 4th there. The Timaeus begins 1, 2, 3, but where is the 4th? The 4th is always the hidden term. It's mysterious, it's missing, and there's always therefore a 3-to-1 relationship in any given quaternio. So we have that. She constructs this quaternio, and all these deities that she discusses in this chapter have androgynous characteristics. So she's specifically looking for classical exemplifications of the androgyne. That's what interests her the most. And she begins by talking about Artemis. Artemis is the mistress of the hunt. She is a transformation probably of the great Minoan lady of the beasts who has been inherited possibly from Minoan Crete. Her name probably is connected with the Greek word for bear, Arctos. There was a bear cult at Brauros that was sacred to her, and one of her companions, Callisto, is transformed into a bear, so that it is very likely that she is connected with a much older, earlier bear cult, and that she wasn't in origin a virgin, but that the Greeks virginized her over time. She is a virgin, and she is the mistress of the hunt, of wild animals and hunters. She has a relationship with the huntsman Orion that eventually leads to his death. Artemis is a great figure. She is the sister, the twin of Apollo. Apollo is the god of the sun, and she is the twin sister. And she is a sleek female warrior type who, Paglia says, represents basically as close to the principle of the Amazons as any of the Olympian Greeks ever got. She is the Amazonian goddess. And indeed, she was worshipped as Ephesian Diana. Diana is the Roman name for her, at Ephesus. And Ephesus was said to have been founded and built by Amazons. And Amazons typically had to offer their right breast, had to cut it off and offer it in offering to her. And so the many-breasted famous statue of Ephesian Artemis may actually be a reference to the breasts that Amazons have sacrificed to her and given to her. Or it may simply be a representation of her as the great all-nourishing mother goddess. Either way, she says that the Amazons are basically androgynes. They're half male, half female in the sense they have half of the body is bare-chested, and the other half bears one breast. And they are warriors, and she thinks that they were probably mythical. There probably never were any Amazons. And there is a good chance that it is possible that the Greeks may have mistaken them, or the myth may have originated from the Greeks seeing Asiatic beardless warriors from a distance with long flocks and mistaken them for women at a distance, and that the myth may have generated out of that. They're said to come from Scythia, which their homeland would be on the northern shores there of the Black Sea. So they may have come out of that region, whoever they were or whatever they were. But in any event, Artemis condenses this for Olympus, crystallizes it, condenses it, and over time, she says, Artemis has been poorly represented in Western art. The way she is represented by Rembrandt as a dowdy matron doesn't do justice to her image. And she comes down through representations by Boucher and so forth as something that has been desexualized. There's been a gradual desexualization process of her over time. And then eventually, so this is the first of her sexual personae, and she's going to connect her later on. She'll say her modern manifestation is Katharine Hepburn in the Philadelphia story. She's totally Artemis with androgynous characteristics right down the line. Cool, serene, aloof, virginal. Men can't touch her. So that's Artemis. Then she moves to Athene. And Athene too, now Athene has androgynous characteristics as well. She is also a virgin, and she is the patron of warriors, not hunters, but of warriors. She protects Achilles in the Iliad. She protects Odysseus in the Odyssey. She is the protectress, the virgin protectress of warriors. And Paglia points out that her incarnations as avatars in the Iliad very often are contrasexual, and she's one of the only goddesses, or one of the only deities who incarnate as their opposite sex very often. Many, many times in the Iliad and the Odyssey, she appears as a man. And now Athena, I think, it's generally suspected that Athena comes from the Egyptians. The Egyptian North African goddess Neith, or Neat, who was also a goddess of crafts and of warriors as well, warriors and crafts. And she's there in the north and may have been brought over, perhaps, who knows, by the Minoans. The Minoans had constant contact back and forth with the Egyptians. So she may have been brought over and imported in that sense. In either event, she was associated with crafts, with thinking and ratiocination. Zeus gives birth to Athena from his head parthenogenetically, and Neith actually came into being, or is a parthenogenetic goddess who builds and creates the world without insemination by a male. So she is the great goddess who creates without insemination by a male. And it's interesting that I think the Greeks, in inheriting her, have translated her parthenogenesis into a male parthenogenetic birth, with Zeus giving birth to her from his head. So we have Athena as the great virginal woman warrior, and then she moves to a discussion then. So we have these two virgin goddesses, and then a discussion of Aphrodite, the whore now, the sexual goddess. She brings in Aphrodite as the goddess of sex. And Aphrodite is a very old goddess. She is definitely an import who has come originally from the island of Cyprus, and in turn probably from the Middle East, where she would have originally been the goddess Inanna, the planet Venus was sacred to Inanna, and she became Ishtar, where she was the goddess of both love and war. And then she migrates to the Middle East, to the coastal zone, where she becomes Astarta. And then Astarta is imported to the island of Cyprus as Aphrodite, where there was a huge copper mine. And this is why the metal copper is associated with the planet Venus and with Venus. And she is born, recall, from the sacrifice, the cutting off of her father Uranus's genitals by Saturn. When the genitals fall into the ocean, foam-born, Aphrodite comes up out of them, and she becomes a major goddess for the island of Cyprus, the goddess of love and sex. She's lost all of her connections with the cult of war. That function is taken over by Athena. So we have this triad of goddesses now, which are sexual personae with androgynous characteristics. She says Aphrodite was worshipped with bisexual characteristics on the island of Cyprus. There was a bearded Aphrodite as well as a bald Aphrodite. So she had bisexual characteristics on that island. And then she brings in Dionysus. She mentions Aphrodite in connection with Hermes, but we won't go into that here. I just want to bring in Dionysus. So she brings in Dionysus as the fourth. the masculine male in opposition to the female trinity here. Dionysus probably was, he is the god of wine, and he probably was an import to Greece from Minoan Crete. That's probably where he came from. As the sculptor Carl Karenyi remarked, before his time it used to be thought that Dionysus came from Thrace. It's most likely that he came from Minoan Crete and is an import. Though he is the son of Zeus, he is not allowed in the Olympian pantheon. He's excluded from entrance to Mount Olympus. So there's a certain otherness about him. And Paglia says he's basically the god of Chthonian nature. The opposite to all these other goddesses have to do with the eye. They're all Apollonian in a certain sense. He is the only one who is purely Dionysian. It has nothing to do with the eye. It has to do with pure, what she calls liquid nature. His association with milk and wine and blood link him with all the fluidic aspects of nature, the Chthonian aspects of nature that disgust the Apollonian male temperament, who turns away from them. We think of Hamlet's disgust when in his monologue, when he's talking about, he's describing the world as an unweeded garden full of things rank and gross in nature that possess it merely. That's the Apollonian male's disgust at the Dionysian realm of the dark biological forces, fluids, bodily fluids, vaginal odors, and all of that that has to do with the Dionysian. She says the Dionysian is what happens when you drink too much of his wine and you end up throwing up. The involuntary spasms and heavings that take over your body are Dionysian. That's Dionysus taking over your body. When the woman's spasms push out, the pregnant woman pushes out the child, that's Dionysus, those involuntary spasms pushing out the child. So this god is associated with Chthonian nature, with the dark realm that the West has turned away from and has been allergic to for a very long time. I think the Greeks were uneasy with this. The Bacchic cults came under persecution more than once. The Romans persecuted them as well. They didn't like them, but they were associated with the worship of women. Women were the primary worshippers of the Dionysus cults. Men were not allowed to participate in and could get into very big trouble, as Euripides in his play The Bacchae writes when he talks about King Pentheus spying through the tree branches at the Dionysus women and their mysteries, and they end up tearing them apart like one of their wild animals that they tear to pieces. So these are the 4 sexual personae that she sets up from ancient Greece in this chapter, with Hermes as a kind of 5th in there as well. These are the 4 sexual personae, and she's going to trace how these personae eventually migrate down through Western culture, through art and literature, all the way down to our popular culture.